Okay, so those of you that have been attending these sessions, you'll know by now that I'm Andrea, and our company is the Export Department, and we've been delivering the EU Exit Support Programme for the East Midlands Growth Hub Cluster. So today we're talking about rules of origin, and specifically within the context of the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement that was released on Christmas Eve. Bear with me, I'm just letting more people in. Right, okay then, so without further ado, we'll just have a quick run through of the agenda. So as always, I'll just mention the EU Exit Programme and how those of you can sign up to it if you've not already taken advantage of some of the stuff that we're delivering. We'll talk a little bit about free circulation of goods and how, you know, what that afforded us when we were part of the single market and the EU Customs Union, and the difference really now that we're out of that. We'll talk a bit about preferential trade to set the scene, what preferential trade means. And we'll talk about originating status. So how do products typically, how's their origin typically determined? And then we'll talk specifically about the Trade and Cooperation Agreement and examine some of the product specific rules within there. Also important that we cover off things like tolerances and insufficient production, because they have a bearing on determining origin as well, and they're detailed in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement itself. We'll cover non-alteration, so when goods are transiting through countries, so they're having a stop off in a third country that isn't party to that preferential trade agreement, how that origin is protected. And we'll talk about returned goods and customs compliance in terms of what you need to do to make sure that you're complying with the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, whether you're exporting or importing. And then we'll cover off a little bit about next steps and how you can have a deeper dive in terms of this particular subject, if that's of relevance to you. So the EU Exit Support Programme, so we've been running this since September last year. We've now run, what would that make us? This is our 11th, I think, webinar around EU Exit. But in addition to that, we're also running dedicated one-to-one support. So we have an initial fact-finding session with you, and then pull together a kind of targeted action plan that you can take away and refer back to. And we can also have follow-up sessions with you, if you like. The good news was that the funding for the EU Exit Support Programme has been extended, so we're still continuing further follow-on support with clients. Here we've given you the future webinars that you can sign up to. So we're talking all about the regulatory landscape. I think that's on the 27th of this month. And then after that, B2C sales with B2C sales and VAT, and also a session specifically on services-based companies. This is the link to sign up to either the webinars or the dedicated one-to-one support. Okay. So I just thought it would be good to cover off, you know, free circulation of goods and what that meant. So essentially, as part of the single market and the customs union, that allows free movement of goods throughout all member states. And the principle applies not just to goods produced in the EU, but also imported goods and released into free circulation. So as per the Union Customs Code, or you might hear it referred to as the UCC, goods released into free circulation have, by means of a customs declaration, had their import duty and other charges collected, and they've had any other kind of commercial policy measures applied, so any licensing or certification that's required, that has been taken care of on import into the EU. And then once those goods are imported into the EU, they're granted union status. So they are free to circulate throughout the remaining 27 member states, if you like, or 26 member states now, as it would be. But should they be exported, they might lose their union status unless they're exported via transit or some other kind of customs procedure. So I think when the trade cooperation agreement was announced and we heard it referred to as zero tariff, zero quota, there was a kind of misconception that it was going to be the same as free circulation of goods. You know, there was going to be no tariff supply under any circumstance, and that's not quite the same. The trade cooperation agreement is not free movement of goods, and there are obviously customs procedures and border controls. Those third country goods cleared in the UK are not cleared in the EU and vice versa. So when we import goods into the UK now, they're only free to circulate within the UK customs territory, which is Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And similarly, when they're cleared for circulation in the EU, they only circulate within those 27 member states, and it doesn't apply to the UK. So should they be subsequently exported to the UK, then potentially customs duties apply on entry to the UK. And I think it's important to mention that even in the absence of any duty, there is import VAT that applies. So we did have the notion of low value consignment relief, but that has been scrapped across the EU and the UK. So essentially all goods will have to, or will be subject to VAT. So what we've seen happen in the EU post transition is we've seen a high percentage of returned goods because they've hit consumers, for example, in the EU, and they've been subject to import VAT at the very least. So they've been UK origin goods, so there's been no duty, but they've been hit by import VAT, and consumers just aren't used to dealing with UK companies in that manner. So we've seen, as a nation, a significantly high percentage of returned goods, and actually the EU is seeing the same, you know, where UK consumers have sent them back. So that's resulting in a lot of unnecessary cost that's hard for companies to bear. And then I think it's important, you know, when we're talking about trade and cooperation agreement, it's origin protocols or rules that determine whether preference applies. And we're going to dig deep into some of those this afternoon. Okay. So in terms of preferential trade, just to set the landscape, so because we've got various different levels of preferential trade. So we've got what we call multilateral agreements. So the best example of that is our WTO, World Trade Organization, agreement, if you like, where there's 164 members and 24 observer governments, if you like, and they've signed up to this kind of global agreement that applies in the absence of a trade deal. So we heard a lot about most favoured nation tariffs and WTO terms should we have left the EU without a trade and cooperation agreement, and that's what it meant. It would have meant that our trade in goods defaulted to WTO terms. So those where we sign up in both the UK and the EU as a member of the WTO, obviously, and where we are trading with nations where we don't have a free trade agreement, then our WTO terms kick in and they cover goods, services and intellectual property. And essentially the whole purpose of it is to kind of lower customs tariffs and reduce other trade barriers. And I suppose as a country that signs up to it, we're committing to open and keep open our service markets. We're setting procedures for dispute resolution and other widely adopted principles around valuation of imports, which we've covered on previous sessions, together with a basic rules of origin framework, which we're going to cover on a slide later on, and how that's been adapted in terms of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So that's kind of like our multilateral agreements, but then we've also got what we call our autonomous or non-reciprocal agreements, and that's when I'm referring to that, I'm referring to the generalized system of preference, or some of you might be familiar with GSP when you hear us talking about GSP nations. So we were party to the EU GSP scheme, and now we've come out of that and we've launched our own UK GSP scheme. So in essence, it's exactly the same. The countries that formed part of the EU GSP have been grandfathered over to UK GSP. It's just the names that have changed. So you know, our least developed countries framework replaces the EU's Everything But Arms, or EBA, that you might have been familiar with. Our general framework really replaces the EU GSP, and then our enhanced framework is the name that for the GSP plus nations. Okay, so Essentially, the Generalised System of Preference was established by the WTO as a mechanism for boosting the exports of least developed nations or emerging economies. So we as developed economies say essentially that we will import the goods from those countries at a reduced or zero rate of duty in an effort to help boost their exports, boost their industrialization strategy, and so on. So the countries that form part of GSP, whether it be EU or UK, are those emerging economies. So we see the likes of Pakistan, Laos, Vietnam, and so on, although Vietnam is striking out and having trade agreements with the EU now, and moving forward will be with the UK as well. So that's GSP, and that's what we class as our autonomous or non-reciprocal schemes, because they don't import our goods at a reduced rate of duty. It's just one way, if you like. And then we have reciprocal schemes, so for our bilateral trade. And when we were part of the EU, you'll hear mention of Turkey, for example, which was a customs union agreement. So that's where Turkey and the EU agreed to eliminate any customs duties in that bilateral trade and had kind of like a joint customs tariff for foreign importers. But Turkey wasn't part of the single market. Obviously, it was just a customs union agreement. But then you have association agreements, stabilization agreements, and then free trade agreements. That's where both sides have agreed to remove or reduce customs tariffs in that bilateral trade. And the EU has a number of deviations from that, partnership and cooperation agreements as well. So you've got all these different types of trade agreement, and the UK at the moment, we've lost access to those 77 negotiated trade agreements that we were party to as part of the EU, and there were some 24 further ones being ratified and 5 being negotiated, China being one of them, which I have to say would be, really good for UK imports, but that's by the by. But the trading landscape after Brexit, essentially we've got 60 agreements in process. So they're at various different stages of negotiation, from provisional application to bridging mechanism to full ratification. I suppose the most notable wins are the UK Japan and the UK Singapore. Japan in particular, because it's a direct replica of the EU Japan trade agreement, which was much celebrated by Liz Truss and the government when it was signed. But then we've also got mutual recognition agreements with Australia, New Zealand, and the US, and so on. And I think what's really important to, letting somebody in, what's really important to get across is that when we're now dealing with lots of different negotiation agreements and lots of different preferential agreements, they will all have different means of claiming origin and proving origin. So you're probably familiar with EUR1s and UK certificates of origin. In the past, we were party to EU certificates of origin and EUR1s. They've now been replaced by the Chamber to be UK EUR1s and UK certificates of origin. So that's slightly changed, but then there will be other trade agreements whereby it's been agreed that origin declarations are sufficient to prove origin. So sometimes in the past that's required our exporters to become approved exporters, or certainly in the case of the EU, they have to register on the registered exporter system. And then we've also had the notion of low value consignments. So consignments of under €6,000 in the past, we've been able to simply self-declare the origin of those goods. But it's important that when we're exporting, we look at the market where we're exporting to, and we understand, what the rules of origin are, so what we have to comply with to say, yes, our goods are of UK origin. And then similarly, what is the proof of origin that we need to provide? And that will vary depending on the trade agreement that you're complying with. I've mentioned it a number of times in previous sessions about the Rules of Origin Facilitator, which was developed by the International Trade Centre and International Chamber of Commerce. And that's a fantastic database. You just do a Google for Rules of Origin Facilitator, because you can put in where you're exporting from, where you're exporting to, the commodity code of your goods, and it will bring up the origin protocols that you need to comply with, and then it will tell you the proof of origin that you need to provide, which saves you, routing through individual trade and cooperation agreements to find those origin protocols, which is which can be painful unless you do it for a living, which is, you know, what we do. I'm sure you guys have got more important things to be doing. So that's kind of like setting the scene in terms of what preferential trade is and the things to look out for. In terms of originating status, so that goes back, as I said a couple of slides ago, to the WTO and the World Customs Organization. They were responsible for developing what we call the Harmonization Work Programme. So that was tasked with liberalizing and expanding world trade, and also imposing precise disciplines on the application of rules of origin, which we're going to cover in just a second. So it was very much the WTO and the WCO that were responsible for that harmonized work programme. And that's essentially, you know, when we talk about commodity codes and tariff codes, and we talk about HS codes, that's where it all comes from. So it's from that program, if you like. But when we're talking about origin, there are kind of two different I can't think of the word. I've just come back from a couple of days away. Now my brain's not working today. There's kind of like two different camps that goods can sit in, if you like. So one would be wholly obtained. So that's where goods occur naturally, and where or goods that are made entirely from things that occur naturally. So I often say, you know, animals that were born and raised in the UK would be of UK origin. Crops that had been sown and harvested in the UK would be of UK origin. You see where I'm going with that. But obviously that's quite easy where there's only one country involved, okay, where those goods are wholly obtained. That makes it a little bit simple, because that concept can be easily applied. But in practice, that's, you know, often restricted to products obtained in their natural state, and you know, those products that are derived wholly from those wholly obtained goods. But in reality, global trade, obviously, you know, we're involved in complex supply chains. If two or more countries are involved in the production of goods, then it's the concept of last substantial transformation that determines the origin of goods. Okay, so it's really that sufficiently transformed, and it's in that camp that a lot of UK goods are sitting at the moment when we're exporting and when we're looking to determine origin. It's that sufficiently transformed. So the rules of origin as set out by the WTO and the WCO kind of focused on three different mechanisms, if you like, to determine the origin. So we had what's called the ad valorem, or the value added rule. We have the change in tariff classification rule, which a lot of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement leans on. And then we have the manufacture from certain products or through a specific process rule. And we see that a lot in the textiles industry. So, you know, those commodities that fall within chapters 50 to 63 of the tariff, a lot of them are subject to this manufacture from certain products or through specific processes rule. But then we also have what's called cumulation as well, and this allows for the kind of originating products of country A to be further processed or added to products originating in country B, as if they'd originated in country B. So how that's worked in the past, for example, would be we've obviously been part of the EU, so there's the same trading bloc, so it's not exactly the same. But let's say our trade agreement with Israel at the moment, which the government's negotiated, so it's active now. That trade agreement with Israel says that for the purposes of trade between the UK and Israel, it is permitted to count EU origin goods towards UK origin goods for the purpose of determining UK origin of products. So that's an example of cumulation. Now there's bilateral cumulation, which is what's party to the EU UK trade agreement. That's where two countries that are party to that same preferential trade agreement, it has that provision that allows them to cumulate origin. So materials originating in either country party to that preference agreement are considered as materials covered by the rule of origin, as not being classed as non-originating, but just for the purpose of that trade between the EU and the UK. Okay, so trade outside of that, it would be party to a different preferential trade agreement, and it would depend on whether or not that cumulation existed. You've then got diagonal cumulation, where you can have you know, more than two countries involved, if you like. So materials originating in a defined country or countries can be used as materials originating in the country of export when used in an export to another country not party to the agreement. So that would mean that the UK could use originating goods in Turkey, for example, to count as UK origin goods to export to the EU. So it's kind of like that three-party or that diagonal cumulation. Regional cumulation we have as well. We see that mainly in the generalised system of preferences, where those emerging markets or developing markets have established groups of countries where origins effectively shared or pooled together. And then you've got full cumulation, where goods that have been worked or processed in a country not in the agreement may still be required as originating. So I think it's fair to say that the UK in its negotiation, it wanted either diagonal or full cumulation. Bilateral cumulation obviously only applies to goods traded within the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, so between the UK and the EU. And that's quite simple because the EU wants to maximise the use of EU origin goods, so they weren't up for having anything other than bilateral cumulation as party to that agreement. So it does pose some questions for UK exporters moving forward, whereby maybe if they were to examine their bill of materials, the makeup of their goods may be predominantly EU or tip the balance, and then depending on where they're exporting to, do they have to strip out that EU element? And if they do, is their product still classed as UK origin or not? And obviously if it's not, then the chances are it's going to be subject to third country duties on import into that market. So a lot to consider there. Just looking at the Trade and Cooperation Agreement itself and what it outlines, so I've touched on some of it, I suppose. As I mentioned earlier, we talked about zero tariffs, zero quotas. So goods originating in the EU, UK free trade area won't be subject to customs duties, but goods that fail to kind of satisfy the relevant preferential origin rules will be subject to normal WTO import tariffs. So that would be the UK global tariff if they were being imported into the UK, and obviously the EU common external tariff if they were being imported into the EU. And as with any free trade agreement, parties can impose anti-dumping, anti-subsidy or safeguard measures on each of those goods subject to them meeting conditions in the relevant WTO rules. So we're protected against, I can't imagine a situation where it would happen with the EU, but if the EU all of a sudden started to flood the UK market with cheaper goods that made it difficult for our domestic manufacturers to compete, then the UK can impose those kind of anti-dumping duties to level the playing field, if you like, which is obviously a term that was used extensively in the negotiations. The other thing to mention, obviously, as I said on the previous slide, there's only bilateral accumulation. So it means that only EU materials used in UK production and UK materials used in EU production will count as originating materials and help to satisfy the product-specific origin rules. But materials originating in third countries, and this is where it hits both sides really, because obviously Japanese parts in UK manufactured goods or Korean parts in EU manufactured goods won't count to satisfy the origin rules. Because, like I said earlier, like all free trade agreements, the agreement really seeks to encourage maximum sourcing within that free trade area, if you like. Processing in the UK can be taken into account to determine whether the product originates in the EU and vice versa. So it's not just the raw material, it's the processing power as well, which is good news. We've got special origin rules. So within the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, there are kind of special origin rules that apply within the context of origin quotas. So meaning that special rule only applies for a limited trade volume, and the standard origin rule will apply for additional trade. Now we see that basically in fisheries and aluminium products. We've also got in the agreement the notion of transitional origin as well. So that's allowing for a higher proportion of non-originating materials to apply early on, like from 2021. And we're seeing that with electric accumulators for automotive use. And and to electrified vehicles, but that's only until 2026. And then that maximum threshold starts to gradually decline from 70% as permitted this year to reducing it to 40%. Now, both sides can come together and review that before 2026 and agree to extend it, so on. In terms of proof of origin, we've got the notion of statement on origin, which is issued by the exporter, or we've got importer's knowledge to certify that the goods meet certain origin rules. So the exact verbiage to be used is in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And it's certainly more flexible than under other EU free trade agreements. So there's no requirement for approved exporter status or anything like that. But there are significant record keeping requirements that you need to be aware of, that we'll come back to those in a second. There's also no drawback clause. So a drawback clause is when no tariff preferences can be claimed by the importer if the exporters benefited from not having to pay any import duties. So say if the UK exporter had brought in third country goods into inward processing, so hadn't had to pay any import duty or VAT, for example, then typically under a free trade agreement, when those goods were exported to the EU importer wouldn't be able to claim that preference, because technically the UK importer hadn't had to pay any duty. That clause doesn't apply. So a UK producer can use inward processing for production in the UK, and then their EU customer can still claim that tariff preference upon import into the EU. So that's a departure from how a free trade agreement usually works, and probably reflects the close integration of our supply chains and trying to alleviate, just some of the burden that we're all feeling right now. That situation is up for review in 2023. So we'll see, certainly both sides are monitoring the implementation of this whole preference system, so it's anyone's guess as to what happens moving forward. Obviously VAT and excise duty, so VAT becomes import VAT, so payable on most goods, because like I say, we've lost that low value consignment relief. And the UK and certainly the UK has, and actually a number of EU member states as well, offer postponed VAT accounting to cover that import VAT, or to, prevent, it really alleviates any cash flow burden, because you're not having to pay as the goods arrive in the country of import. And imports of excise goods, so tobacco and alcohol and so on, will still attract excise duty as per rest of the world imports. There are some facilitations in existence, but in principle they'll still be subject to import duty or excise duty. Licensing, so both the EU and the UK can impose license requirement on goods, but as per the WTO terms, they must be transparent, fair and non-discriminatory. What was quite good was the dual use general license system that's already in place between the UK and the EU to reduce burden on exporters that are party to those commodities but need that dual use license. And then finally, certification. So sadly, there's still no equivalence on sanitary and phytosanitary measures for those, those products of animal origin or plant-based products, which is causing significant barriers to trade. Similarly, they're still thrashing out the details around financial services, because there's no equivalence there either. So there's a ton of stuff that they're still pretty much at the negotiation table with, but in the meantime it is causing a little bit of pain. Looking at product specific rules, so if we just talk about how they're generally, if you imagine it kind of like as a toolkit, so a bag of tools, and then each free trade agreement will pull various bits from this bag to make up product specific rules that are party to their preferential trade agreement. So they're all based on the a harmonized system. So it's based on the HS codes, as we talked about, so those harmonized system codes, which is that description and coding system that classifies those goods. Obviously, we know the tariff is organized logically, so you have, animals and animal products are found in one section, whereas machinery and mechanical appliances are found in another, and it kind of goes from limited processing right the way down to highly processed goods towards the bottom. But essentially, anybody that is contract to that convention on the harmonized commodity description and coding system, so the HS system, bases their tariff schedules on those HS codes, if you like. Okay, so for some goods in the trading cooperation agreement, it's combining, so product specific rule is combining two different rules of origin. So as I said before, there's change in tariff classification, there's value added rule and so on. And what you'll find within the agreement is that quite often it's combining them. And it's also creating the, when we see change of tariff classification, it can be at 3 different levels. So some product specific rules might say that it requires a change in chapter. Some may say it requires a change in tariff heading, and some say that it may require a change in tariff subheading. So chapter being the first 2 digits, and tariff heading being the first 4, and then tariff subheading being the next 6. So you'll see that. But then they combine quite often with certain goods, they'll combine that change of tariff classification either with a maximum value of non-originating material, or it will be an either or, so change of tariff classification, or alternatively you can use the value added rule. Okay, so when you're looking at and those companies that we've been working with, we've been having them establish bill of materials for their goods. When you're looking at that non-originating material, you have to work on what we call the cost insurance freight value. So you have to, if you're basing it on value, then you have to look at the value of the goods to get them to the UK. That's what you base. That's the price that you put in your bill of materials. We see some products that are based on weight, so maximum amount of non-originating material by weight, and we see that in food products, for example. And then your where you're basing it on value, then it's on the ex works price of the goods. So the price of the product paid, excluding any freight and insurance. And obviously, if the ex works price isn't reflective of any production price, then you include selling and general admin and expenses and profit, but you keep the transportation separate. So even where you might look at it on face value, you think actually we've got quite a lot of non-originating material making up our goods, just remember that you need to take into account the processing and margin and so on to make up your ex works price, and it may work out that you then fall beneath the threshold for non-originating material. So like I say, we have been helping companies to establish this in preparation. We couldn't tell what the rules of origin were going to be in the trading cooperation agreement. It was like a finger in the air, but we knew that if our clients had an understanding of the makeup of their goods, then they were going to be in a better position to navigate the rules of origin when they were announced in the agreement. So clients were pulling together Excel spreadsheets that might just have, obviously the finished product, and in there the component parts, and by that it would be a description of the goods, the origin of those goods, maybe the commodity code of those goods, and then the percentage that they make up of the finished product, whether that be by value, ex works value, or whether some of our clients that are in the food business by weight. And then they've been able to apply the product specific rule after that point. Okay. So just moving on to some basic examples here. So I pulled out this one I prepared earlier. This example is of a leather suitcase. Okay, so you find the product specific rule in the trading cooperation agreement. So the finished goods is obviously articles of leather, saddlery, harness, and so on, and within that can be a leather suitcase. That's how you define it. And when you look at the product specific rule in the trading cooperation agreement, it's basically saying that for products that fall within that that part of the tariff requires a change of tariff heading or maximum non-originating material of 50%. Okay, so we have our component parts. We've got the leather, which originates in India. We've got the zip originating in China, the metal fastener originating in Taiwan. And I'm sure some of my clients would bop me over the head right now and say that's far too simplistic, but I just kept it simple for the purposes of today. And then the finished goods is this suitcase that has an entirely different chapter heading to any of its components. So in terms of whether the product specific rule has been met, it has been, because the finished goods have a different tariff heading from all of their constituent parts. So that maximum non-originating material threshold of 50% didn't have to apply. We didn't have to default to that other part of the rule. So here we can say that the goods are of UK origin. Okay, so that's one example, very simplistic one, but nonetheless, it's had a completely different tariff classification as a result of the processing that's taken place. So therefore, that product-specific rule has been met, and it's of UK origin. Move on to the next one. So in the food preparation here, so we've got rice pudding. So that falls within chapter 19, and here the product specific rules are a lot more in depth. So it's basically saying that all that you can have a change of tariff classification, provided that, so it's got some provisions in there, that all materials of chapter 4 are wholly obtained. So they're kind of like those dairy produce, so that milk and that butter has to be wholly obtained. Now it can be from the EU or from the UK, because we've got that bilateral accumulation, which is great. And then materials of heading 10.06 and 11.08 don't exceed 20% of the weight of the product. So again, you'll remember me talking about how food is typically weight rather than ex works. And then the total weight of non-originating materials of heading 17.01 and 17.02 do not exceed 40% of the weight. Now, in this circumstance, the product-specific rule hasn't been met. Okay, so we've got our dairy product is of UK origin, which is absolutely fine, but the finished goods have a different tariff heading from all of the constituent parts. All the materials, like I say, from chapter 4 are either UK or EU origin, but the non-originating material, so that rice from Thailand, exceeds the 20% threshold. So those goods can't be classified as being of UK origin. So that's an example of quite a complicated product specific rule, where it says, yes, you can change the tariff classification, which we clearly have here, but only providing these other elements have been ticked or met, if you like. So in those circumstances, we can't define that rice pudding as being as UK origin. Tolerances are an interesting one. So in all rules of origin in EU free trade agreements and preferential trading agreements contain what we call tolerance rules. They're also known as de minimis rules. So these allow manufacturers in certain countries, or in countries that are party to an agreement, to use non-originating materials up to a certain preset percentage value in the production of goods with originating status. So usually based on ex works value of the final goods. Or the weight. But what's really important to remember is when the specific working or processing rule already provides for the use of non-originating materials, you can't then use that general preference rule to exceed the percentage specified in the list rule. So it's useful in certain circumstances, but it can't supersede the product specific rule when that already sets those thresholds. So the Trade and Cooperation Agreement contains two tolerance rules, principally pertaining to food and drink, and then the other ones to textiles. So if you're involved in those two sectors, then I would suggest that you look at those tolerances that are laid out in the Trade Cooperation Agreement, or get in touch and we can go through them together. Okay. So here is an example of a tolerance rule. So this is for, as I say, textiles and textile articles. So the tolerance in note 7 is applicable to products containing 2 or more basic textile materials. So, and the tolerance rule basically says where the product contains 2 or more basic textile materials and the weight of the non-originating basic textile material taken together does not exceed 10% of the total weight of the basic textile material used. So here I've given us woolen yarn from Canada with a 5% weight and synthetic yarn from Vietnam with a 3% weight. The origin rule has been met because the non-originating materials combined do not exceed that 10% weight of the overall the finished textile material. So here we can clarify, or we can classify those goods as being of UK origin. And here, when we're talking about taking a food and drink example as well, the product specific rule for dried fruit and nuts, for example, is all the materials of chapter 8 that are used must be wholly obtained, and the total weight of non-originating material from 17.01 to 17.02, which is sugars essentially, doesn't exceed 20% of the weight of the product. So the tolerance permits the use of non-originating ingredients forbidden by the rule, in this case edible fruit and nuts or other products within Chapter 8, but the total weight of the non-originating materials cannot exceed 15% of the net weight of the product. So in this case, the rule's been met because all of the materials from Chapter 8 are originating, with the exception of non-originating goods that fall under the tolerance threshold of 15%. So the finished goods are of UK origin. So again, that's an example of the tolerance rule in action when applying to food and drink. Okay, insufficient production is really important to mention as well, because this trumps product specific rules. So even if your product meets all of the kind of requirements of that product specific rule, if the processing that you're doing in the UK is insufficient, then you cannot determine those goods are of UK origin. So a free trade agreement will always list these processes that, if they're carried out on non-originating materials, are considered, just such minor changes or such minor processing that they don't on their own confer originating status. So as I say, even if a product meets its product specific rule, if the only process carried out on non-originating materials is listed as insufficient, that product won't obtain that originating status. And we see reference in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement to the term simple. So some listed operations can clearly be identified as insufficient, so like sticking a label on the product or so on, but some listed refer to simple, so maybe simple assembly or simple packaging or something. And this refers to operations that don't require any kind of special skill or machinery or apparatus or any kind of equipment to produce those goods, if you like. So it's really important to be aware of what your processing looks like in the UK, and to consult those insufficient production list in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, because it has an impact on accumulation as well. So if the only processing carried out on the product in the UK is insufficient, it won't meet the rules of origin, even if the processing was carried out on EU originating material, or a further processing, beyond insufficient was already carried out in the EU. So it's really important that you understand the impact of those rules on your products. And the example here, I've given a couple actually. So with grated cheese, the rule is that all the materials of Chapter 4 are used wholly, and the total weight of non-originating material of 17.01, 17.02 doesn't exceed 20% of the weight of the product. Now here, the cutting rule or the cutting process is qualified as simple. So if the only process is grating, so without any specialist skills or a machine especially installed for the process, then the grated cheese would not be deemed as UK origin. Okay, even if the cheese had, as in this example, had come from the EU, so therefore it was bilateral accumulation. If the only process, that grating, is classified as simple, then it wouldn't classify as UK origin, which means if you imagine a situation whereby the cheese has come in from the EU to the UK, when it's grated, when it goes back into the EU, it will attract a third country duty on import into the EU, because we haven't determined UK origin. So crazy situation whereby, EU customers are paying, import duty potentially on EU origin product when it's come back from the UK, which is a little bit crazy. Frozen nuts is another example. So here the product specific rule says that all materials of Chapter 8 have to be wholly obtained, and the total weight of those non-originating materials, 17.01, 17.02, don't exceed 20% of the weight of the product. All shelling of nuts is an insufficient process. So even if machinery is used in the process of the shelling, then it wouldn't be considered UK origin. So even again, the example I've given here is that that the nuts or the raw material are of EU origin. So we've got that bilateral accumulation, and they're technically obtained within the EU. Because they've just been shelled in the UK, then it's not sufficient to determine UK origin, so they'll face a third country duty on re-export to the EU. And this is typically how free trade agreements work. It's not just a kind of, failure of the trade and cooperation agreement. I wanted to talk about non-alteration because, as I said before, where the goods are, they may be stopping over in a third country that isn't party to the EU. And I can't really think of an example of that actually, where they would be rooted, but just say they were a trade and cooperation agreement. Usually these preferential trade agreements contain rules covering that transportation of those preferential goods from one party's territory to another. And it's really the purpose of it is to make sure that goods arriving in the country of import are exactly the same as they were when they were exported, if you like. So that preferential nature of that origin of goods hasn't been impacted in any way. So where they're transiting through a different country, then they have to be kind of kept within customs supervision, if you like, for that preferential trade to continue, for them to keep their originating status. So they can't be released into free circulation, they've got to stay within a customs procedure. So when they're in customs storage, so if there's, setting off, they're being held in a warehouse or something like that, then it's permitted to split consignments because you're under that customs supervision, so that's permitted. But they must stay under that customs supervision for the conditions of the direct transport rule to be fulfilled, if you like, when they're going through that third country. So you might be required to provide proof of compliance with that rule, but that's typically, sufficient for that would be a single transport document that covers kind of like the passage of the goods through the country of transit, or you might obtain a non-manipulation certificate that's issued by the authority in that country where the goods have, temporarily stayed. But it's something that you need to be aware of. Returned goods, this is an interesting one. So UK origin goods that are exported to the EU and then are re-imported back into the UK without any form of processing to confer EU origin would, by default, attract a third country duty on re-import back into the UK because they'll be deemed as non-originating. So we have to prove that they are returned goods, if you like. So we have to prove that the goods are the same as those exported and that they haven't undergone any processes other than basic preservation in that third country during export. So it's possible to obtain duty and VAT relief on those goods when they're re-imported into the UK, provided that they were in free circulation in the UK when they were exported, unless they were exported from a customs procedure like inward processing or something, that they haven't been exported to be repaired or processed, anything like that, and that they've been re-imported within 3 years of their export. So long as you can prove those three things, then you should be able to gain relief on any import duty or VAT on goods that are returned from the EU back into the UK. But the process of going through that is a little bit complicated. So you need to make sure that the import declaration references the original export entry, and you need to have the right customs procedure code on the import declaration as well, which we've talked about CPC codes and so on a lot in the past. And you'll need to provide the original export declaration to HMRC when you're claiming that relief. So it has made returned goods more complex because in the past, we wouldn't have had any of this. The goods would have been returned, and that would have been it. But now they're subject to declarations and potentially import duty and VAT if we can't prove the kind of premise for their re-import, if that makes sense. Okay. So in terms of making sure that you are compliant moving forward under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, and there's no nasty surprises from HMRC or anybody else, when you're claiming origin, as an exporter, you make that statement on origin. So it's your responsibility as the exporter to provide sufficient detail to identify the product, and then on the commercial invoice or any other commercial documents, like packing list is okay, but bill of lading isn't, that you provide that statement on origin, and it can be valid for 12 months to a maximum of 24 months, and it can apply for a single shipment or multiple shipments that happen within that 12 months, if you like. So that's from an exporter. It's that statement on origin, and believe you me, if it's not verbatim, then it will potentially attract, those goods will attract third country duty in the UK, in the EU when they're imported into the EU. We had it a lot at the beginning part of the year when companies were just, simply putting origin UK, and because there wasn't that specific statement on origin, the third country duties applied on import into the EU. So that's really important that you get that verbatim statement. And then as an importer, you can have that importer's knowledge. So where your supplier is not providing a statement on origin, then you can gather sufficient documentation to satisfy yourself that the product's originating. If the supplier can't provide that, then they're going to have to provide a statement on origin. Otherwise, without one of the two, you're going to face third country duty on import into the UK. There are some exceptions to claiming origin. So the EU has set a threshold for small packages. So if you're importing goods into the EU that are under €500, they don't have to be accompanied by a statement on origin. And in the UK, if you're importing goods under £1,000, they don't need to be accompanied by a statement on origin. And then there's other thresholds for personal luggage as well. You must remember that on the customs declaration for the import declaration that you're declaring the right codes in the right boxes, and we see this as well. The commercial invoice might have the statement on origin, but actually because the preference code hasn't been completed correctly on the import declaration, then those third country duties have applied. So you need to make sure that either you or whoever's completing the declaration for you is making the correct preference declaration in a preference code in box 36, which for goods party to the UK-EU Free Trade Agreement will be a code somewhere in the 300s to say that we've got that preferential trade agreement. And then it could be possible, I haven't actually seen it happen, but it might be that in box 44 of the import declaration that statement is actually referenced there as well as a mechanism for proving origin. So just be on top of that as well. It is possible, obviously, to retrospectively claim any duty that you've been charged. So you can claim that duty back if you can prove that, preference existed. But it's just a paperwork hassle that you don't want to be bothered with, really. In terms of record keeping, so where you are importing goods under importer's knowledge, you have to maintain any statement on origin documents or records pertaining to your importer's knowledge for 3 years, because HMRC can come at any point and say you imported these goods under preference, where is your proof? So they can go back 3 years for that. As an exporter, it's 4 years, so you need to maintain a copy of the statement on origin in your export dossier. So when you're keeping, you should have that anyway, because when you just think about proof of origin, for example, you've got your whole export dossier there, so that would include your commercial invoice, which HMRC can go back 6 years for proof of origin. So you should have it anyway, but for statement on origin, you need to keep whatever proof you supplied for 4 years, because that's how far they'll go back. And also bill of material is good practice as well. Those bill of materials that I talked about, maintain those so that during an audit they can be fully inspected and they have all of that relevant detail around your calculation and so on. The UK and the EU, like I say, has committed to very tight cooperation in terms of seeing how the preference agreement is implemented. So as part of that, they will cooperate if either side needs to check anything. So if, say, for example, your customer is importing your goods in the EU, their local customs authority can go to them as part of an audit and say, well, you've imported these goods under preference, where's your proof? If they can't provide that, then that EU customs authority can come to HMRC that can then approach you as the exporter. So it's really quite tightly integrated. They've agreed to that really full cooperation in managing that whole preferential trade piece. And then I suppose just be really aware of the kind of mechanisms available to alleviate the duty and VAT burdens on importing goods. So the likes of inward processing, outward processing, customs warehousing, just be aware of them. We've not really had to think about them with trade with the EU before, because we've been part of the same bloc, but there are those mechanisms that can alleviate some of those issues. So you know, a classic example would be if you're importing if you're importing goods from the rest of the world, and you could say that you're doing some you're doing some kind of processing on those, or some kind of manufacturing on those, and then you're subsequently exporting the finished goods to the EU, then you can permanently suspend, under inward processing, you permanently suspend that import VAT and import duty on those goods that are going to be subsequently exported to the EU, which allows you just to adjust your pricing to your EU customer, because you've got to remember we've become a little bit more burdensome to deal with, a little bit more pricey to deal with the cost of declarations and so on and so forth. So it's just a mechanism to adjust your pricing and try and you know, overcome some of these burdens that have been kind of thrown in our way. Okay, so be aware of those. And again, via a one-to-one session, we explore all of those based on your current model and which one would be most applicable for you. So that's really it from me. I'd like at this point to ask if anybody has any questions, if anybody wants to unmute themselves. There's no such thing as silly questions. If I'm answering one for somebody, I'm sure somebody else is benefiting from the answer as well. Does anybody have any questions at this point? Or have I put you all to sleep? Oh dear, I have. I've put you all to sleep. Well, at that point then, I would just say my contact details are here. Obviously, you've got details of the EU exit programme. So if there's anything that you want to cover off and you think that it would be best to go through a one-to-one session, then that would be absolutely brilliant. We can sit through it. We can sit down and go through your specific needs and requirements. As I say, the next session is the 27th of this month, where we're talking all about regulatory changes and looking at it from the lenses of different sectors. So, you know, please join me again for that. But if there's no questions, I will just say thank you very much, everyone, and see you on the next one. Okay, thanks everyone. Bye bye.